A warm welcome to Asia Art Archive. I'm Özge Ersoy, I'm the Public Programs Lead. And on behalf of the team, I want to say that we are very happy and honored to have Rasha Salti with us today. You might already be familiar with Rasha's biography, but maybe just a couple of words to introduce her. Rasha Salti is a researcher, curator and writer based in Beirut and Berlin. Rasha is published extensively. She curated numerous exhibitions and she developed film programs with lots of different international organizations, arts organizations and festivals. I just want to keep the bio part really short and just want to say a couple of words about why we are excited to have her here. Rasha's practice is focused on these long-term research-driven curatorial projects. So these are about lesser known histories, these are about connecting dots, these are about archive building, and maybe more importantly, storytelling. And Rasha will speak about two of these projects today, Saving Bruce Lee and Past Disquiet. And as the AAAT, we've been following Past Disquiet for a number of years. Maybe I can just say a couple of words about that. For a couple of reasons. First of all, it's an extensive research project that Rasha and Christine Huri, who's also with us today in the audience, they've been developing together for over 10 years now. And it's a research project that revolves around an exhibition that took place in 1978 in Beirut. And so we are drawn into this type of projects, and especially this particular project for a number of reasons. First of all, it looks at a social history that's around this exhibition. At AAA, we look at exhibition histories for thinking about how we can make the lesser visible histories known and discussed. So exhibition histories part is definitely one part of the equation. And then secondly, the project looks at a very particular international solidarity network. And also, similarly at AAA, what we try to do is not only look at artists and artworks, but to think about how these artists are part of larger communities. And how their ideas, how artworks, how artists themselves, how they move around and how they are connected across national borders in Asia and also beyond Asia. So for today, we very much look forward to learning more about the questions that Rasha has been building in her practice. And I just want to say that she'll also start with one of my favorite animals. So I'm also excited for that. Rasha, thank you so much once again for being with us.
Thank you, Özge. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Claire. Thank you to the whole team of the Asia Art Archive. I'm extremely happy to be here. It's my first time in Hong Kong, and I think I am really eager to come back. This talk is about two of the projects in which I was deeply involved as a researcher and a curator. One had to do more with visual arts and the other with film. And when I've started working in the field of culture before the notion of curating reached the global south. And at some point, I began to identify myself as a curator, and I realized that I'd been doing it before without knowing. When I reflect on my I can't say the word career, but when I reflect on my work, what I've done, the projects I've pursued, what has interested me, I am unable to fit in boxes or categories. And that is why when I talk about my practice, I think of this cute animal, the platypus. So some curators are fascinating and generous. Other curators are fascinating and ungenerous. And the third kind, to which I belong, are geeks. And geeks will find the platypus on the internet and build metaphors in order to avoid describing the intrusion of the real and how and the everyday struggles of an independent and a freelance curator who insists on reading poetry and watching film and working in film festivals and researching museums and artists and organizing visual arts exhibition. So as you can see, the platypus is a sort of animal that's in between species. It's neither a duck nor a beaver. It is very fragile. It lives in very specific environments, and only the male is venomous. The female is gentle. So I'm not going to expand. I'm not going to like do the ultra geeky thing, which is to explain a metaphor. But I think from the description of various different sources on the internet, you can guess how the precarious existence of an independent curator with multiple interests resembles the life and the constitution of a platypus. In my practice, I have gravitated towards two things. One, I never work alone. I hate to work alone. I've always worked with other curators, other researchers. I find that when the process is a dialogue, is much more interesting. It's much more enriching. And whatever can seem frustrating to anyone is actually when you have to accommodate for someone else, even if it sounds like a compromise, it's actually an enriching compromise. The other thing that I've observed about myself over the years is that I'm really interested in research-based projects, in projects that require that I step out of my comfort zone, that I step out of the pre-established knowledge that I have and perceptions of the world. So the first project that basically kind of brings me here is this one, Past Disquiet. Past Disquiet is the title of an exhibition that first came to life in 2015. But it is also the outcome of research that in 2019 has become 10 years old. So I met Christine Khoury in 2009. And at the time, we decided that as two people interested in the history of modernity in the Arab world, in the arts, that we were frustrated that there were so many questions that seemed unanswered. And we decided that we would start working step by step, that we would try to answer questions, some basic, some eccentric, by conducting little research projects. And the first one was about the first one answered the question, when was the first time that an exhibition of modern art was shown in Lebanon? And one of the answers that we discovered was when the Musée Imaginaire, or the Museum Without Walls, a project sponsored by the UNESCO, was exhibited in Beirut in 1957. Then the second project, which we thought was something we could also research relatively easily and in the end come up with an article to be published somewhere or participate in a conference, was around the story of this international exhibition of art for Palestine. So we found the catalog And we were very curious because we had never heard of that exhibition. And from flipping the pages, we realized that the scope and the scale was, and at least at the time, remained unprecedented in the region. It was thoroughly international. As you can see from the invitation card, the languages on the invitation card, Arabic, English, French, that was somewhat not surprising for the time, but then German and Japanese were really surprising. The exhibition took place in the basement of the Arab University, and that basement hall today is storage, and it's not really an art space or a gallery or a museum type space. So we set out on trying to understand how the exhibition came to be. These are the two posters of the exhibitions. Let me just say that in the end, this is what we found, that the exhibition opened on March 21st in 1978, and that it was initially planned to remain open to the public for 2 weeks, and it was extended until April 25th. It was organized by the Plastic Arts section under the Office of Unified Information of the Palestine Liberation Organization. So the Palestine Liberation Organization had two entities. I'm not going to call them ministries, but departments. One was the Department of Information that apparently had this Plastic Arts section, and another one was the Department of Culture. Oh, what am I doing? What I'm trying to do is, scroll down the text. Can you show me how to scroll down? I need to see here. Great. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it had two departments, one Department of Information and Department of Culture. It was curious that it was done under the under the supervision of the Department of Information and this Plastic Arts section. The exhibition was intended to be a seed collection for a museum for Palestine, which would remain in exile until Palestine was free and democratic and the museum could be established there. The catalog has or counts, lists approximately 200 works that were donated by 200 artists from approximately 30 countries. So these are the two posters that were produced for the exhibition. The one on the left is designed by Iraqi artist Diya Al-Azzawi, and the one on the left by Moroccan artist Hamad Al-Milihi. The artwork on the cover of the catalog was a painting donated by Argentinian artist Julio Leparc. So these are the pages listing the artists that in the catalog. They are organized by country of origin of the artist. One of the complications of the research was transliteration. For example, with the Japanese artist or the Polish artist, we realized that the catalog was bilingual, that basically it had been, the names had been phonetically transliterated to Arabic and then from Arabic to English. So people were basically making up names of artists. And when we tried to Google, it was hard enough, but then when we were showing the names to experts wherever, it took several stages of digging until we could find the right people. This is the page acknowledging, thanking people who participated in the making of the exhibition. So we conducted interviews with what we identified as the usual suspects, meaning intellectuals, people who would have liked to go to an art exhibition in 1978, who were living in Beirut, people who were close to the Palestinian cause. And we realized that the traces were scant. Some people remembered going, some people remembered going and remembered one or two artworks, but we could not find traces in institutional archives. This is the text over 2 pages from the catalog signed by Mona Saudi, who was the director of the plastic art section at the Office of Unified Information. The text was very useful to us because it clearly stipulates that the exhibition was intended to be a seed collection for the building of a museum. So when this notion of a museum in exile came to be, or a museum in solidarity, we decided that we wanted to dedicate our efforts to understanding what it means. And so we discovered significant intersections between this exhibition, the International Art Exhibition for Palestine, and, for example, the Museum of Resistance, the International Museum of Resistance in solidarity with Salvador Allende. The short name is MIRSA, which was organized by Chilean exiles and their supporters after the 1973 coup d'etat in Chile. And we also found intersections with its earlier incarnation, the Museum of Solidarity, that existed in 1971 until 1973, until the coup d'etat. We found also intersections with the Museo de Arte Latinoamericano in Solidaridad con Nicaragua, Museum of Latin American Art in solidarity with Nicaragua, that emerged under at the behest of the Sandinista leadership. And the fourth case study of a museum in exile or a collection in solidarity is titled Art contre/against apartheid, that toured internationally in the years leading up to the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa. The catalog for the exhibition in Beirut, the International Art Exhibition for Palestine, was and remains the most tangible and complete way in which we can understand the scope of the collection. So I'm going to show you a few images from the pages of the catalog. What is a museum in exile? A museum in exile, this is the lithograph by Joan Mir. In our interviews with various people, the Mir works seemed to come up. People remembered that there was Mir works. People thought sometimes they referred to them as paintings. They were in fact 2 lithographs, or so we think. But for some reason, his name is the most prominent name in the recollections. So what is a museum in exile? A museum in exile is a collection of artworks donated by artists, their gift being a political gesture intended to demonstrate support for a movement of national liberation or a struggle for justice and equality. Museums in exile and other solidarity collections are important models of museology that have been almost entirely marginalized, even silenced, in the annals of art history and museum studies. Such collections were a political act conducted by artists, curators, critics, art historians, and militants to affirm the significance and righteousness of a political idea. At the same time, they are not embedded in the systems of patronage and power to which museums are traditionally beholden. In that they are not symbols of wealth accrued through the exploitation of human beings or natural resources, neither are they the legacies of colonialism. They represent a thoroughly subversive interpretation of museums, and their collections are requested and donated in the name of people, not governments. This is the work by Julio Loparc. And this is the work by the two Brazilian artists in the collection, at least the ones that are listed in the catalog. His name is completely misspelled. His name is Gontran Guanais Neto. Neto was a very militant artist, and he's actually one of the few that is involved in the 4 different museums in solidarity or collections in solidarity. Palestinian artist, he passed away last year, sadly. He was living in Paris. Samir Salami. Another Palestinian artist, Suleiman Mansour. He lives in Ramallah. He was in Ramallah, and he actually smuggled and was able to come and visit the exhibition in Beirut. This image is iconic, and one of the things that we realized in our research is how images circulated. This image appears in the exhibition as a painting, but then you'll see it reproduced as a poster, on calendars, as a postcard, meaning that the sanctity of an artwork that is supposed to exist in one form only, that was never regarded so seriously. Basically, a painting could become other things and could exist in other people's homes as a reproduction while the artist was still alive and without the question of royalties, etc. This is a painting by a Palestinian artist who lived in Japan since 1971. His name is Vladimir Tamari. His sister is a very well-known Palestinian artist, Vera Tamari. Vladimir passed away in early 2018 or 2017. He was an incredible man, and his being in Japan was part of the interesting meshwork of Japanese-Palestinian solidarity. This is a painting by Gérard Fromager, a French artist. So what was interesting, so Christine and I started doing this research in 2009, and one of the big questions that we were asking ourselves was, who are these artists? Because some names, of course, Miro is recognizable, Tapies is recognizable, and some of the big, very well-known modern Arab artists were totally identifiable to us, but there were a lot of others that were not. And in the 10 years of the research, we have seen maybe a revision or an awakening in the institutions. For example, 3 years in 2011, there was a retrospective to Julio Loparc. Julio Loparc had been forgotten for at least 2 decades before that. And in 2016, there was a retrospective dedicated to Gérard Fromager at Centre Pompidou. So I'm just going to go through these images a little quickly. And these I'm showing you not innocently, of course. You'll understand later why. But the painting on top is by a French artist called Claude Lazare. And Claude would become a central protagonist in our research and in the weaving of the narratives that we ended up authoring. The painting below is by the only collective in the collection, at least that we can identify. And this French collective was closely affiliated with the Communist Party in France. They produced paintings in a series, and they produced rather figurative work. And they were very famous for unhanging their work rather than hanging their work. This is a drawing by Mona Saudi, and so the custodian of the exhibition and the director of the plastic arts section. And next to it is a painting by engraving by Nasser Soumi, also Palestinian artist, who at the time was her assistant. So in the face of a complete absence of institutional archives and a reliance on interviewing individuals and collecting their testimonials and their memory, first of all, we couldn't possibly apply for funding. We didn't know where we were going. The more we asked questions, the more we had questions. And we understood, so we decided that the catalog was going to be our guide. And we decided to try to go through the lists of names just to see who's alive, who's dead, and try to contact people. I had met Claude Lazare a few years earlier by pure coincidence, and then in 2011 we were able to travel to Paris and meet him. And these are photos from our visit to his studio. He's showing us a poster which is basically an image of a painting that he did when he was in Beirut. So it turns out Claude Lazare had a lot of keys to the questions that we were asking. First was, so basically he's a French artist. He was politicized, and he was part of a group called the Jeune Peinture. And this group of artists, the Jeune Peinture, was an organization of artists that decided to, that basically were anti-establishment. Since the end of World War II, if you were an artist in Paris, you could not exhibit your work if you did not have a gallery or if a museum was not interested in you. So a group of artists get together and they decide to rent a place or ask for a place to organize an annual salon to show their work. Over time, they became more political. After May 68, they become radicalized, and Claude was part of them. Claude was also very close to Azzeddine Kalak, the PLO representative in Paris. And Claude knew Chilean artists who had come to Paris fleeing the Pinochet dictatorship and had heard of their initiative to create a museum in exile, and so decided to propose the idea to Azzeddine Kalak. There were other ideas too. I mean, one of the things that we learned was that if you're trying to explain one big event, there's never one version of the story. An event seems to be the crystallization of many people's desires and aspirations. Everybody wants to be the author or the father of an idea, but an idea is really is a coming together of a lot of people's desires and aspirations. Azzeddine Kalak decided to to pursue the idea of building a museum in solidarity with Palestine. He contacted Mona Saudi. A lot of efforts came together, and that's how the exhibition came to be. And that's how we understood that a museum, that's where the idea of a museum in solidarity with Palestine came from. Unfortunately, Azzeddine Kalak was assassinated in the same year of the exhibition, in 1978, in August, in Paris. He was a very peculiar man. He believed that the struggle for Palestine should come from the grassroots up. He was very he was very cultivated. He loved, he wrote short stories, but he loved the visual arts and film. And so a lot of his friends were artists, and he asked them he commissioned posters. He asked artists to make posters for Palestine, and he was also involved in the making of a film. he also refused to carry weapons, and he refused to have a bodyguard, and so he was an easy moving target. Let me see if I... yeah. So the other museums in exiles that were also inspired by the Chileans, as I mentioned before, were the one for the people of Nicaragua, in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua, and the one against apartheid. I will tell the stories of these other museums very quickly. In trying to highlight the intersections between the stories. So with Claude Lazare, we actually were able to meet Neto, who's on the left, and Julio Leparc, who's on the right. These two men were an absolute joy to meet. Neto passed away last year, or in 2017, and he was adorable. He was adorable, but he was also incomprehensible. And he's short and hairy and moves a lot. And Leparc is very tall and skinny and speaks extremely clearly and in a very low voice. So the interview that we filmed with them is two voices speaking at the same time, commenting on each other while we're trying to ask them questions. But they are inseparable companions. The one, Neto, makes very figurative work. Leparc is famous for his optical art, but they were inseparable, and they were very involved in the struggles for democracy in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. They were part of different collectives of artists that produced murals in public spaces. Okay, back to Beirut. Claude, when we went to his studio for the first time, of course we had exchanged emails and we explained to him why we were interested in meeting him. He greeted us by saying, I've been waiting for you for 30 years. And he had 3 boxes ready. It was actually his wife who had the boxes. One box contained photographs, the other newspaper clippings, and the third copies of documents. And so we suddenly had images to attach to all these stories. So these are photos of the installation of the exhibition in Beirut. This photo has, so what happened to, so we're dealing with a complicated history. We're dealing with a complicated history that does not have institutional archive, that does not have official narrative, and we soon learned it's a history of a moment of great expectations that were broken or defeated. And so the people narrating those stories are people who feel disenchanted or sidelined or marginalized. So it's a history that has a lot of wounds. And our first instinct when we found images was, besides extreme excitement, was forensic, was to try to understand who is each person in the photo and where is it taking place and why are they doing what they're doing. But then these images lived with us. I mean, I think it was extremely hard to work for 10 years with extremely little funding. Christine and I are the biggest supporters of our own project. But the silver lining in when a project takes its own time is that you're not under pressure to deliver and produce in an economy of contemporary art. And so these images stayed with us for a long time, and we did, as we were asked to transform our exhibition, our research into exhibition, we were looking at those images at different stages over years. it only occurred to me maybe 5 years ago, why are they doing this banner when they have a super sophisticated poster with 5 languages? Like, why would they need to use, it's a very traditional banner. It's one that you find in the street. If a new shop selling refrigerators opens, they make this banner which they hang on top of a street. So it was, it was interesting, the juxtaposition of languages. Here are images of the installation, and from these photos were super useful because we used them as memory prompts. So because we're dealing with a wounded history, or a history where people felt they were wounded, they were not given their due credit. One person that we interviewed who was part of the Department of Culture, not the plastic arts section, and basically who was the rival to Muna Saudi. She told us when actually Christine interviewed her. When Christine interviewed her, she told her, "Oh, I know about the exhibition. I had nothing to do with it. We were pushed aside. We were cast aside." And then Christine shows her the images. She says, "Isn't that you in the photo?" And she says, "Oh yes, maybe at the last minute they asked us to intervene." And basically, more images prompted more memories. But if we did not have those images, we could not have gotten as far. So the exhibition opened on March 14th, and the Israeli a week before the exhibition opened on March 14th, the Israeli tanks rolled into South Lebanon up to the southern city of Tyre. And the invasion was big. It was some 25,000 troops, soldiers coming into Lebanese territory. The objective was to expel the Palestinian resistance from Lebanese territory. The operation lasted a week. It ended with a UN-brokered truce and the deployment of a UN-sponsored peacekeeping force to oversee the implementation of the peace accords. The hostilities, of course, continued, and the Lebanese civil war ensued, and fighting intensified until Israel would invade Lebanon again in 1982. I'm saying this as context for the opening and for the fate of the collection and the museum. So these are images from the opening. You see Azzeddin Kalak on the extreme right, holding a cigarette, guiding the PLO High Command into the exhibition. I take secret pleasure in thinking that he showed them a photo that says sex shop. Here you have, in the photo you see Ismail Shammout, who was the bald guy, who was a seminal Palestinian artist and who was also the head of the Department of Culture in the PLO, and who was the head of the Union of Palestinian Artists. He is surrounded by 2 men who work for the German Democratic Republic Embassy. And eventually, these 2 men become the object of our inquest, and we were able to find them. Several artists were invited to attend the exhibition, several international artists, but considering the context and the situation, the invitation was limited to only 6. The PLO could not handle the security of more. There were Bruno Caruso from Italy, Paolo Ganna from Italy, Claude Lazare, of course, from France, Mohamed Melihi from Morocco, and Gontran Monaes Neto from Brazil, whom I already mentioned. This next photo is a photo that is also interesting. So the artwork, it's a photo of an artwork by a French artist called Jacques Mano. Jacques Mano was like an important artist that in May 68, I'm glad Jalal is shaking his head. He did a series called Assassinations, and it was like they were intended as a critical reflection on the culture on the transformation of popular culture and the popular imaginary in France, because TVs had become part of households, and detective and murder series were being broadcast and were becoming super popular. So he painted on mirror. The series is painted on mirrors, and in this mirror, you see the reflection of Azzeddin Qalaq talking to the PLO cadres. Again, I think it was a few years after we had received that photo that Christine remarked that it was actually a photo of something that was going to happen. It's a photo of a future event, not of a past event. And this prompts me to talk about something that basically has been part of this research and the curatorial process, namely ghosts. So when I'm going to just mention this. So there's a neurologist who wrote a novel that I listened to on the radio who said, you die 3 times. The first time, I'm saying this in front of the philosopher of the undead, but it's fine. You die 3 times. The first time when your heart stops to beat. The second time when they put your body on the ground or burn it. And the third time when no one ever says your name again. And in fact, what we were doing with this research is just saying the names of people who had died, who were no longer there, and who were probably insignificant. Ghost shares its root in English with guest. And so I think we were inviting the ghosts. Our research was not at all methodical. It was at all not scholarly. We very quickly realized that there were so many different narratives on the same event that fact-checking was not going to be possible. And rather than become obsessed with fact-checking, we decided to find the speculative mold in which we could reconcile these wounded histories. So I personally became obsessed with Azzeddin Qalaq, and I'm convinced I saw his ghost in Paris while I had fever and it was cold and I was on a residency in a convent. But then I realized that I was not the only one who had been visited by his ghost, but the poet Mahmoud Darwish, apparently, during the siege of Beirut in 1982 by the Israeli army, as Mahmoud Darwish kept a diary in which the question was whether he should stay and die or go and survive. And one night during the hallucinations of being under siege, he was visited. It was also August. He had no electricity. He was also visited by the ghost of Azzeddin Qalaq, and he talks about it. And I just will mention a small verse of poetry that was guiding us as we conceived the curation of the exhibition. Night descends upon us, and we must tend to the concerns of those who left us their own private night, forgetting or recalling a portion of the long farewell. Farewell is the silence separating sound from echo. Sound is broken, and the echo is preserved by attentive valleys and caves. The world's ears, listening closely as it reverberates into the echo of an echo. Another photo, seminal to histories of exhibition, the dinner with artists. And again, we were, our concern was to find out who was who in the beginning. But again, but after a few years, we start observing body language. We start observing dynamics. We start trying to imagine what was being concocted there at those dinners. And in fact, this photo is a beautiful photo because it incarnates, or it gives life to this notion of solidarity, of international solidarity between artists. When we were looking at the artist list, what the first instinct was to see who was absent. Because when we were looking at the Arab artists, there were some obvious names that were not there. And then we quickly reverted and decided to focus on what was there. And to try to excavate the links between those names. And so, so behind these stories of museums in exiles, there is a network of artists across the world at play. And they're willing to travel to Lebanon during the war to have dinner. Italians with Palestinians, with Lebanese, with whatever. Another image that is perhaps more associated with international solidarity, that is perhaps today caricatural, but also what is the place of that image in art history? So when we interviewed Neto and Claude, they were like contradicting stories on whether the Palestinian freedom fighters shoved the Kalashnikovs in the hands of the artists and asked to take the photo, or whether the artists insisted on taking the photo with artists with the freedom fighters carrying Kalashnikovs. So the man on the left is a very well-known figure in French contemporary art history. His name is Michel Troche. He is famous for something called the rapport Troche, the Troche report, that basically restructured the entire relationship of the French state with art, with the production of art, decentralizing it, creating bodies that collect art throughout the French territory, not only in Paris. He was very close to the Jeune Peinture. He traveled to Beirut. He wasn't at the opening. Claude Lazare waited for him to give him a tour. And not only did he see the exhibition, but he also visited the fighters. The two images on top of each other are the artists in a forest clearing on the battlefront. They insisted on carrying the catalog to carry the catalog to the freedom fighters who were engaged in battle. Sorry. Next photo is, so in addition to the exhibition, there was a workshop in which Claude Lazare participated with Nasser Soumi, the artist in the middle, who was the assistant of Mona Saudi in setting up the big exhibition. And on the extreme left is Khalil Akkari, a Syrian artist. So they did a workshop, and the workshop, that's when Claude was able to have a real Kalashnikov, so he painted it. And they organized an exhibition in the courtyard of the Beirut Arab University. And that's one of the ways in which we began to think about the circulation of images. And in the next image, yeah. So you see a Fidai, a freedom fighter, Palestinian freedom fighter, looking at a painting of a Kalashnikov. For a long time we were puzzled, whether we should include this photo when we do the exhibition, because of the many different meanings of freedom fighter today, especially in Europe, of the Kalashnikov. And B, what does it mean that a freedom fighter should be staring at a painting of a Kalashnikov? One of the interviews that we found in the archives, in newspapers in Beirut, a journalist organized a roundtable with the international artists and had a conversation with them. And so they're disagreeing as to what is revolutionary art, what represents Palestine. One Italian is upset with artists who send just artworks that have nothing to do with representing revolution. And then at some point, there was a young freedom fighter walking around, sort of eavesdropping on the conversation. And the journalist stops and asks him who he is and why he's here. And he says that he's on a break from the battle in South Lebanon, and he heard about the exhibition, and he was curious. So basically, it was his day break, and he came to see the exhibition. And I decided that was the guy. I have a photo and I have a story, and I put the two together. It's probably wrong, but that's why we call the exhibition speculative history. So it was a museum in exile, so it traveled. It was a collection in solidarity. It traveled to Japan. It was part of an exhibition called the Exhibition for Restoration of Human Beings and Nature, hosted by the Japan Asian, African, and Latin American Artists Association, JALA, that took place at the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum in July '78. One artist accompanied the exhibition, Mustafa Al-Hallaj. He made the trip to Tokyo. And these are more images, of the exhibition. And actually, this prompted a real collaboration between the Union of Palestinian Artists and JALA, this association of Japanese artists. Palestinian artists were invited to go to Japan, and Japanese artists came to Beirut to produce work. A catalog was produced as a result of this exhibition, and this is how we found new works. And this is how we found out that the collection kept growing. The exhibition also traveled to Tehran, to the museum, actually upon invitation from the Writers' Union. Mona Saoudi traveled, Mustafa Al-Hallaj, and it also was invited to two places in Norway, at Oslo and another town that I cannot pronounce, Kristiansand or something. Yeah, Kristiansands. That was in January and February 1982. But then, in the months and years following the International Exhibition of Art, artists continued to donate work to the collection. In 1982, during the Israeli siege of Beirut, the offices of the PLO were shelled, including those housing the Office of Unified Information and the Plastic Arts section. The fate of many works from the collection remains officially unknown, although both Mona Saoudi and Palestinian artist Abdul Hayy Musallam claim that some of the works were rescued before the building was completely destroyed, and they were placed in safety in the custody of trusted friends, as well as in Mona Saudi's home. Other artists claim, without evidence, that some works were sold privately and were seen in collectors' home a few years later. Specifically, Joan Mir's lithographs were spotted in Amman. We have confirmed that 43 of the works which were taken to Tehran for an exhibition in 1980 remain in storage at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. In recent years, the Palestinian delegation at UNESCO, as well as Palestinian artist Nasser Soumi, have undertaken respectively the tasks of documenting and searching for the artworks which rightfully belong to the Palestinian people. And this is a photo of the painting. I showed you the image in the catalog. This is the real painting on exhibition in Tehran at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Abdul Hayy Musallam, the artist, the Palestinian artist who went to the wreckage of the building and carried artworks and put them in a truck and took them to Mona Saudi's home. He's very old, but he lives in Jordan. He's a very peculiar artist. He had a key to the office, the Plastic Art Section office, and he made a work in honor of the Plastic Art Section office. You can see the key embedded in the painting that he made. And you can see that some Palestinians take extreme pleasure in mixing the P and the B. Plastic Art Section. So that's for, I mean, we dedicate a lot of time to the Palestinian exhibition story because it's like, it was the spine of our research and it's the spine of the exhibition. The 4 other museums in exile, their story very quickly. The Solidarity Museum emerged actually under the government of Allende. He took office in 71. He took office in 1970, and the right-wing media, the media was in the hands almost exclusively of the right wing. And they were portraying the country as being on a pathway to disaster because of his socialist program. And so to counter that, he decides to stage a big communication campaign, which he calls Operación Verdad, in which he invites writers and journalists and intellectuals to come to Chile to witness firsthand what is the Chilean version of socialism. At the same time, Mario Pedrosa and other important figures, curators, art historians, and art critics in Chile propose to build a museum in solidarity. So Allende signs the call to artists to donate work, to build a collection in solidarity with Chile, with the people of Chile. Mario Pedrosa was a Brazilian art critic and curator. He was living in Chile because in exile because he had to flee the military dictatorship in Brazil. So the museum opened in late 1971. That's the photo. That's a photo from the opening. There was an incredible participation. The first opening happened with 600 works. And then, sorry, yeah. So you can see the call to artists signed by Allende, and then underneath it's translated in French and English. This is the cover and the back cover of the catalog. That's an artwork by Miro. And the text by Mario Pedrosa explains what does it mean to have a solidarity museum. And that people, this is a museum for the people, and it's a museum of experimental contemporary art. 1973, the coup d'etat, the military takes over a lot of institutions, state institutions, including the building where the collection was stored. People are able to take most of the collection and hide it in the caves, in the storage area of the Museum of Fine Arts. But nonetheless, the building where the exhibition had taken place becomes a military, is taken over by the military, becomes a military outpost. So the Chileans are driven to exile in different countries, but as soon as they arrive and are settled, they decide to launch another museum in solidarity. So it starts in Paris with artists and intellectuals like José Balmes, Pedro Miras, Mario Pedrosa, Miguel Rojas Mix, and they involve French people. They create committees in different countries and again send out a call for artists to donate works. This is the poster of the call for the museum. They call it the International Museum of Resistance for Salvador Allende. This is the first artist who donated. There's a lot of intersections with the artists who donated for Palestine and then Nicaragua and South Africa. And that's how we felt we were actually in the right track, that we were actually unearthing a network. We were not unearthing isolated stories or case studies. What else did I want to say? Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to say, I wanted to say that these committees appear in France, Poland, Switzerland, Finland, Mexico, and Cuba. And when the dictatorship in Spain is replaced by, is no longer in existence, there was also a committee in Spain. And these, the artworks travel, the exhibition takes place in different countries, in different places. These are some examples. And in 1990, during the presidency of Patricio Aylwin, the process, so it's the return to democracy, the process to repatriate the various portions of the collection around the world begins. The Salvador Allende Foundation was instituted by presidential decree and was assigned to the undertaking. A third museum emerges, Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende. It is inaugurated at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, so the Fine Arts Palace, in 1991, but then it moved, and now the collection has 2,700 works from 3 different phases of its evolution. The MSSA continues to recover works. Not all the artworks that were donated have been repatriated to Chile. The process is extremely complicated, but this museum has been a vanguard in, I mean, they have so much to teach in how to negotiate with governments, who represents the people, and how to recover what was stolen within Chile by the military dictatorship. The images, so this is the building. These are images from their website. So when they know they have an artwork that has not been collected, that has not been recovered, they post the title, but not the image. The Nicaragua Story. In 1980, during a festival in Rome held to celebrate the first anniversary of the Sandinista revolution, Ernesto Cardenal, renowned poet and minister of culture in the new Nicaraguan government, met Carmen Vo, a Chilean gallerist and arts administrator who had played a role in establishing the Museum of Solidarity in Chile in the beginning, and then played another role in the museum, the International Museum of Resistance, so the MIRSA, when people were in exile. So she decides to embark on this adventure of building a collection of artworks for a museum in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua. Vo spearheaded the project and was assisted by Virginia Espinoza, Nicaraguan cultural attaché in Rome. In December 1981, 2 exhibitions titled Art pour le peuple du Nicaragua were inaugurated in Paris and in Madrid. Works by Spanish artists and Latin American artists were mostly exiled in Europe, made up the collection. Many of the donors to the Nicaraguan initiative were the same artists who had contributed to the MIRSA collection, as well as the International Art Exhibition for Palestine. 300 works were sent to Managua, financed by the French government, and were added to the artworks donated by Venezuelan artists and then more artists. The collection kept growing. So we have not been able to confirm this. The poster, you see the names of the artists listed on the back, whether the poster was made by Ernest Pignon Ernest. And here in this photo, you can see the Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar, who spent a lot of time in Nicaragua and wrote beautiful texts and books, and Carmen Vo is in the middle. There was no building in Managua to house and display the collection, so it was presented for the first time in the foyer of the Teatro Popular Rubén Dario. And of course, the exhibition was inaugurated by the President Daniel Ortega on December 9, 1982. At the time, oh my God, 5 minutes left. At the time, the collection was called the Museo de Arte Latinoamericano Contemporáneo de Managua, but it was later renamed the Arte de las Américas Solidaridad con Nicaragua. Okay, I think I'm not even halfway, which shows how ill-prepared I am. Maybe I'll just skip to the conclusion, because So basically, that's the story of that was the story of the Nicaraguan exhibition. This is the story of the Art Against Apartheid collection. The Nicaraguan exhibition is in, the collection is in Nicaragua, but is in storage, pending the political process. The collection of for South Africa is in South Africa. It's also in storage at an archive center that belongs to a university and has not been donated to a museum. The 4 stories of the museums in exile are very much attached to the political entities that championed them, instigated them. And so only the Chilean story has a happy end, or is able to turn the page somewhat. But I perhaps want to end with this. So yeah, sorry, I'm gonna have to zip through. I want to end with this. Thinking of museums based on donations and gifts, thinking of museums instigated by artists, curators, and art historians at a time when the market, 1970s, 1980s, the market was really taking over, and this happens completely parallel and outside the market. Financially, in monetary value, these collections are worth millions. They are unique. They are unique in the international, transnational conversation that they have. And in symbolic value, what they mean is, for example, imagine, I mean, closer to Hong Kong is probably the Rohingya, and closer to where I come from is the Syrian refugees. But when political exiles are able to build museums, the equivalent today is refugees. Today it is unimaginable that refugees can build such collections. And maybe I leave you with this last image, again on the circulation of artworks and how we think in terms of art history about the paintings and the artworks, and whether, and what agency do we give images. The image on the top right is Claude Lazare looking at his painting in Beirut in 1978. The image on the top left is an exhibition in a public space in Italy by an artist collective in solidarity with Palestine. It's an exhibition in public space. You can see the painting. You can see 2 paintings. The one below is the one he donated to Mirsa, so it's today in Santiago, in the collection of the museum in Santiago. Do I have any more time? That's it. Yeah. So another image is basically, this is what started the story of the Art Against Apartheid collection. This is an action by artist Ernest Pignon-Ernest in 1974, when the mayor of the town where he comes from, Nice, in the south of France, a traditionally right-wing town, decides to do a twinning with Cape Town under apartheid. And to protest this action, the artist decides to make this life-size drawing, reproduce it, and plaster it all on the walls on the trajectory of the mayor of Cape Town visiting Nice to sign the agreement. That same drawing is the drawing he donated to the exhibition of In Solidarity with Palestine in 1978. Again, these museums or these collections are linked regardless of whether Christine and I were there, or regardless of whether we are forcing or we are extracting the threads, the images themselves create those links. And that's how we made sense of 10 years. We constantly did this. We drew names and events and tried to create linkages. We basically translated our mind maps to drawings like that. Okay.
Thank you so much,
I'm sorry.
Rasha. No, thank you so much. If you have any comments or questions, maybe we can have the next 15 minutes for this.
Oh no. Nah.
Well, can I ask you to talk about the networks of the other project, about the Bruce Lee project? Maybe that's, if I'm not asking too much, but
No, you're
maybe
not.
just to, it'll be a way to just talk about what other networks and circulations look like for a similar moment in different practices.
Is that a fair question? She's asking me to continue the lecture, basically.
Of course.
Or just talk about networks within the story.
Or you can talk about what you're going to do with all the material.
Oh, that comes next time. I want to hear about Saving Bruce Lee. Okay, Saving Bruce Lee is... These are the many... We don't have a website yet. So this is a bit of Saving Bruce Lee. Sorry. He's been with me for a long time, and he's capable of beautiful wisdoms. Coincidence and serendipity. Saving Bruce Lee starts for me in 2006. I'm organizing a retrospective of Syrian cinema in New York, and I realized that most of the Syrian filmmakers of a particular age group and who are quite accomplished. I once dragged Jalal to a film where he was tortured from the heavy breathing, but they all studied in Moscow at the VGIK, Moscow's most extraordinary film school. And the peculiar thing about the Syrians who studied in Moscow is that they studied during the Cold War in the heart of a totalitarian system. And instead of being trained as propagandists, they come back home and they make films that are banned and censored. So clearly the Soviets did not train propagandists, they trained subversives. And then from interviewing the filmmakers, I realized that they had roommates that were from Sudan and Mauritania and Algeria and Vietnam. And fast forward to 2013, I meet Koyo Kuo in a cafe, and she tells me that this new museum is, that basically the Garage Museum in Moscow has a new director who's great, and that she's been commissioned to do an exhibition, research-based, and that she wants to study the African students at the film school in Moscow. And I beg her to take me on board and to include the Arabs, and she says yes. And so we decide to explore. So basically, if solidarity, in some way with past Disquiet, solidarity was a spontaneous thing in the context of the Cold War, and in the former East, it was a government policy. It was a top-down policy. And so here we are really in the heart of cultural diplomacy, and the Soviet Union disbursing scholarships for filmmakers. I mean, they did it for doctors, engineers, accountants, whatever, but we were focusing on the filmmakers to study film in Moscow. These are some of the names. This was a project that basically found only resistance because the film school has archives, refused to deliver any archives. The museum is dedicated to contemporary art, does not care about film or knows about film, so all of our research assistants were completely confused. Eventually, the museum was opening a new building, and we were supposed to show something in that new building, so we showed, we did a display in a room of the research that we found. The research that we found, so the Soviet institutions were close to us, so all we could do was interview the filmmakers. And that's where we found out that this whole aspect of film history, Arab and African, has never been studied as a legacy of Soviet cinema, has only been studied as a legacy of, has only been like disregarded. The networks, they put the Arabs and the Africans, the third world, is in a special dorm. And it was an extremely lonely existence in Moscow. So the networks were practically impossible to extract until, yeah, the project eventually did not happen in Garage. It was canceled, and which is sad and terrible. But then, so this is part of the display at the Garage. It was canceled, but 2 years later we were able to present something at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin, and there we no longer had the Garage as a sponsor. We found an academic scholar, a French, who speaks Russian, who studies the subject, and she was able to infiltrate all the archives, get as many documents as we wanted, photographs, films. She got everything. So this is where we understood that we actually fell in the internal politics in Moscow, everything surrounding an institution like the Garage and public or state. And it's part of working in with the archives, is basically sometimes public institutions are afraid of the private sector and private initiatives and private museums, and do not want to open their doors and expose their archives to those protagonists. Did I answer your question? Can I just say this? So one of the filmmakers, I asked him, in Berlin, he had to pick one film of his teacher, of his mentor, and screen it and introduce it. His mentor passed away. So he picked a film, and he said that, and I asked him what remains of the film school in Moscow in his head, or what he learned there. And he said that he learned that cinema is the relationship between beauty and justice. And, you know, he studied in like 79. So Brezhnev, like, worst time. It means that when we are looking at the Cold War, when we are looking at the former East, we can't just look at state policy, etc. And the experience of people is really important in rethinking art history, in rethinking film history. My God, we're far from the Platypus, and I make no sense, but you're still here.
Perhaps I can ask a question.
Yep.
I'm here. I think going back to past Disquiet, I was really interested in how you talked about exhibition as speculative, or making a speculative history. And I'm sure all the artists that you interviewed for this project, they have a different sense of belonging towards this Museum in Exile project that they were part of. And I wonder if you dealt with any sort of skepticism or any type of frictions or any type of just curiosity about your own agency in making that speculation through the exhibition in the end.
I mean, again, you know, there are artists who were, the Museum in Exile, or building that collection, is a part of a whole set of understanding art and producing art that was completely different. So they were also making murals in public spaces. They were going all over and trying to be present as artists who believe in changing the world. And when you interview them 20 years down the road, and their life has not mattered to anyone, they have not made it. I mean, they may have exhibited in Documenta, or they have, but in the end, they are not in the canon. So those that were not in the canon, those that have not been considered important, relevant, or meaningful to art historians, or art critics, or curators, those are bitter. There are others who insist that they did it all. Nobody else did it. But basically, I mean, like, I'm sure, I don't know, I'm sure about my family. Like, even if you want to narrate, I don't know if you've ever tried to, or witnessed preparation for a big event. You know, everybody wants to claim the idea, etc. So I think we are dealing with, they saw us as a captive audience, and they saw us as a chance to write them into some kind of a history. Those who trusted us, because there were many who didn't. And so we tried to understand or find a space where both their narratives can coexist. Perhaps some were upset that we didn't give them as big a role as they had claimed. Or others were upset that we had mentioned their enemies.
I don't want to take somebody else's... I think I would like to thank you. I mean, both Rasha and Christine. I saw the exhibition in Beirut, and I think it was the most fascinating exhibition I had ever seen in my life. And as I walked through it, my feelings were, on the one hand, to be extremely happy to see all of this excavated, which was hidden somewhere before. On the other hand, I was extremely sad to think about all that's not excavated yet, just because nobody, like you two, has taken an interest in it. I mean, obviously it's the two very engaged individuals taking interest that all of this has come to light somehow. And I guess we're all struggling somehow, being curators, or others like me, for example. I'm more in the civil society sphere, in the political sphere, to see that there's no real international solidarity anymore around issues of liberation or self-determination. I mean, who goes on the street today for Palestine, or for the Kurds, or for, you know, other people fighting for self-determination? It's now completely different issues. It's climate change, it's, I don't know, freedom of expression. But nobody feels inspired anymore, it seems to me, to go on the street and understand these issues not as national issues, but really issues of international interest. And I just wonder how, you know, curators and people who are active in the political sphere can actually come together through exhibitions like this, and how this can be taken, you know, to people active in civil society or others who should actually be inspired by this.
I mean, I think the manner in which artists are politically engaged today, and the manner in which militants solicit them is different, but it's still very much alive and happening. But it's different. But I can tell you that in the course, in the time span that we cover, so from the 60s to the 80s, the struggle of the Palestinians changes from referring to itself as a revolution to a cause. And that's also a sign that's within the span of the project. That's also a sign of the times. I mean, I have no doubt that artists will always be pushing like the boundaries of the imaginary, and now that I see the Gilets jaunes in Paris, and I witness how filmmakers rally around them, how they solicit filmmakers and filmmakers rally around them. And and of course I think of our research, and yeah, times are different, but I think not much. But I think taking to the street, it means something else nowadays. And at the time they could go to the street, there were no cameras, there were no security cameras. Jose Balmes arrived with a shirt on his back to France. And it took him maybe a year to have papers, but he was constantly protesting. Can you imagine somebody who's undocumented? What? Yeah, I mean, it's different rules of the game, I think. But still, like at that time, dock workers were refusing to unload ships that came from dock workers in Venice, Greece, and Marseille were refusing to unload ships that were coming from South Africa and from Chile. And today the same thing is happening with shipments of arms from France to Saudi Arabia. So, yeah. I'm so sure I was incoherent. I regret. I don't know what to do with this. You should put it on your website or something.
We very much enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Rasha. And thank you for joining us again.
Thank you.
Thank you.